Welcome to the world of stories. Here you will find the most exciting and engaging plots about the challenges and secrets of millionaire families. Love, power, betrayals, and second chances. Each story is a dive into the fascinating universe of the rich and powerful. Prepare to be moved, surprised.
Sarah Matthews sat at the small kitchen table in her cramped apartment, the ticking of a worn-out clock marking each passing second. The walls were painted a dull beige that had long since faded, and the linoleum floor carried scratches and stains that told the story of years of wear and tear. Ethan, her 6-year-old son, was sitting a few feet away on the living room carpet, his tiny hands piecing together a puzzle he had already done countless times. His quiet focus was a comfort to Sarah, a rare moment of peace amidst the chaos of their lives. Her gaze shifted to the pile of unopened bills on the table, the envelopes marked with bright red stamps that read "Final Notice." Each one was a reminder of how precarious their situation had become. She sighed deeply and sipped her lukewarm coffee, its bitterness doing little to mask the heavy knot of anxiety in her chest. Sarah had been a mother for 6 years, and a single mother for almost as long. Ethan's father, a man she thought she would spend her life with, had walked out before their son's first birthday. He had left behind promises that quickly turned to dust and debts that Sarah was still paying off. She had tried to move on, to build a life for her and Ethan, but the weight of responsibility never seemed to ease. Her days were a cycle of exhaustion. By 6 a.m., she was up, preparing Ethan's breakfast and getting him ready for school. By 8, she was at her job as a waitress at a diner on the outskirts of their small New York suburb. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid just enough to cover rent, utilities, and groceries, barely. There was no room for extras, no safety net for emergencies. Tonight was no different. The diner had been busy, the kind of busy where her feet ached from constant movement and her face hurt from forcing polite smiles. A group of rowdy customers had left a meager tip after monopolizing her section for hours. One of the cooks had called in sick, leaving the remaining staff overwhelmed. By the time Sarah clocked out, her shirt was damp with sweat, her hair smelled faintly of grease, and her patience was threadbare. Yet, walking through the door to see Ethan's face light up always softened the edges of her fatigue. "Mommy, look, I finished it," Ethan exclaimed, holding up the completed puzzle for her approval. "That's amazing, sweetheart," Sarah said with genuine warmth, kneeling down to kiss the top of his head. His hair smelled like the strawberry shampoo he insisted on using, and it made her smile despite everything. Ethan grinned, his missing front tooth giving him an irresistibly mischievous look. "Can we do another one together? Maybe tomorrow, okay?" "Mommy's really tired tonight," Sarah said, hating the way his face fell but knowing she didn't have the energy to give him the attention he deserved. "Why don't you get ready for bed? I'll come tuck you in soon." As Ethan shuffled off to his tiny bedroom, dragging his favorite stuffed dinosaur behind him, Sarah leaned back against the counter and closed her eyes. She thought about the dreams she once had, the life she had envisioned for herself. At 21, she had been full of ambition, studying business administration at a local college and dreaming of running her own company someday. But those dreams had been put on hold when she found out she was pregnant. Not that she regretted Ethan, not for a single moment. He was the light of her life, her reason for pushing through each day. But there was no denying how much she had given up, how often she felt trapped in a life that seemed to shrink around her with each passing year. A knock on the door startled her, breaking the quiet. Sarah's heart jumped, and she hesitated for a moment before crossing the room to open it. Jill, her best friend since high school, stood on the other side, holding a plastic bag filled with takeout containers. "Surprise! I brought dinner," Jill announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Jill, you didn't have to do that," Sarah said, but the smell of Chinese food was already making her stomach rumble. She hadn't eaten more than a handful of fries at the diner all day. "Of course I did," Jill replied, setting the bag on the table. "You've been running yourself ragged, and I figured you could use a break." Sarah smiled faintly, grateful as always for Jill's unwavering support. They sat together at the table, splitting in order of lo mein and egg rolls. Jill was a whirlwind of energy, her stories about work and dating filling the small apartment with a vibrancy that had been missing all evening. "You need to get out of here, Sarah," Jill said suddenly, pointing her chopsticks at her. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about this." Jill gestured around the room. "The stress, the bills, the non-stop grind. You're going to burn out if you keep this up. You deserve more." Sarah laughed bitterly. "And where exactly am I supposed to go? This is my life, Jill. It's not like I have a million opportunities knocking on my door. Maybe not a million, but how about one?" Jill reached into her purse and pulled out a flyer, sliding it across the table. Sarah picked it up and read the bold letters at the top. "Career Advancement Program, fully funded training in business administration." "It's a long shot," Jill admitted, "but I thought of you as soon as I saw it. You've got the skills, Sarah. You just need the chance." Sarah stared at the flyer, her mind racing. The program sounded too good to be true, but what if it wasn't? What if this was the opportunity she had been waiting for? "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "It's probably super competitive. And even if I got in, who would watch Ethan while I'm in training?" "Stop thinking of reasons why it won't work," Jill said firmly. "Start thinking about why it could. You're smart, you're capable, and you deserve to have a shot at something better." Sarah looked at Ethan's bedroom door, her heart heavy with the weight of her responsibilities. She wanted more for him, a life where he didn't have to see her constantly worrying about money or working herself to exhaustion. Maybe Jill was right. Maybe it was time to take a risk. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Sarah sat at the table with the flyer in front of her. The ticking clock filled the silence as she reached for a pen and began filling out the application. It felt like a small step, but it was more than she had taken in years. As she finished, she glanced out the window at the stars above the city skyline. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. She had no way of knowing that her life was about to change in ways she could never imagine. The sun had barely risen when Sarah sat at the breakfast table with a cup of coffee in hand, her eyes scanning the application she had filled out the night before. A strange mixture of hope and doubt churned in her chest as she double-checked her answers. It wasn't the first time she had dreamed of escaping her circumstances, but it was the first time in years she had taken any real step toward making that dream a reality. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his pajamas slightly wrinkled, his hair a wild mess from sleep. He rubbed his eyes with his tiny fists and looked at her with a sleepy smile. "Good morning, Mommy," he said, climbing onto the chair across from her. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" Sarah asked, trying to push her worries aside for his sake. "Yeah. I dreamed I was flying a rocket ship," Ethan exclaimed, his face lighting up with excitement. Sarah chuckled, reaching over to smooth down his hair. "That sounds amazing. Maybe one day you'll really get to fly one." Ethan tilted his head thoughtfully. "Do you think rocket pilots eat pancakes?" Sarah laughed, her first real laugh in days. "I bet they do. Lucky for you, I happen to be an expert pancake chef." As she stood to start breakfast, she found herself glancing at the application one last time. The deadline was in 3 days, and if she didn't mail it out today, she risked missing the chance entirely. Jill's words echoed in her mind. Stop thinking of reasons why it won't work. Start thinking about why it could. Later that morning, after dropping Ethan off at school, Sarah found herself hesitating outside the post office. The application was neatly sealed in an envelope, tucked safely into her purse, but she still couldn't bring herself to take the final step. What if she wasn't accepted? What if this program turned out to be another dead end? Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from Jill. "Did you mail it yet?" Sarah sighed, typing a quick reply. "I'm standing outside the post office now." Jill's response came almost immediately. "Go." "No." Sarah smiled despite herself. Jill had always been the louder, bolder one between them, the type of person who believed that risks were worth taking even when the odds were slim. Taking a deep breath, Sarah walked into the building, her heart pounding with every step. When the envelope finally disappeared into the slot, a wave of nervous relief washed over her. It was done. Whether or not she was accepted, at least she wouldn't have to live with the regret of not trying. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine. Sarah's shift at the diner was hectic as usual, with customers coming and going in waves. Her boss barked orders from the kitchen while the clatter of plates and silverware filled the air. By the time her shift ended, her feet ached and her back was sore, but a small flicker of hope had taken root inside her. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Sarah sat on the couch with an old magazine Jill had left behind. It was glossy and bright, filled with images of a world Sarah could barely imagine: mansions with swimming pools, glamorous parties, and luxury vacations in exotic destinations. One article in particular caught her eye: the elite of Manhattan, inside the lives of the city's richest families. The feature showcased the glittering lives of billionaires, their wealth presented as something almost mythical. Sarah read about multi-million-dollar apartments overlooking Central Park, private jets, and invitations to exclusive galas that most people could only dream of attending. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that those kinds of lives were far removed from her reality. But part of her couldn't help wondering, what would it be like to live without the constant weight of worry? To wake up every day knowing that everything, every bill, every decision, wasn't a struggle? The face of one of the men in the article caught her attention. His name was Alexander Carter, and according to the profile, he was a real estate tycoon worth billions. The accompanying photo showed a tall, dark-haired man in a tailored suit, his piercing blue eyes staring directly into the camera. There was something in his expression, cool, confident, almost untouchable. Sarah shook her head, laughing softly at herself. Men like Alexander Carter didn't exist in her world. Even if they did, she wasn't foolish enough to believe they'd take notice of someone like her. She closed the magazine and pushed it aside, feeling a little embarrassed by her moment of fantasy. Still, as she lay in bed that night, the thought lingered. She didn't need a mansion or a private jet, but she did wish for a better life. For herself, for Ethan, for the version of herself she had once dreamed of becoming. The following days passed slowly. Sarah couldn't stop herself from checking the mailbox every afternoon, even though she knew it was too soon for a reply. Ethan noticed her anxious energy and asked her about it, and she explained, gently, without too much detail, that she had applied for something that might help them. "Will it make you smile more?" Ethan asked, his question catching her off guard. "I hope so, sweetheart," Sarah said softly. On the third day, the mailbox was empty again, but Sarah found a small surprise waiting for her when she got home. Jill had left a gift bag on her doorstep, along with a handwritten note. "To the bravest woman I know. This is just a little something to remind you how amazing you are, no matter what happens." Inside the bag was a journal with a beautifully embossed cover that read, "Dare to Dream." Sarah ran her fingers over the words, feeling a lump form in her throat. Jill always seemed to know exactly what she needed, even when she couldn't articulate it herself. That evening, after Ethan was asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of her. She wrote down everything she wanted to achieve, everything she hoped for Ethan and herself. The words poured out of her, a mix of practical goals and wild, improbable dreams. She wrote about wanting to pay off her debts and move to a better neighborhood. She wrote about wanting to finish her degree and build a career that made her feel proud. And then, almost without thinking, she wrote about wanting to feel loved. Not just by Ethan, but by someone who saw her for who she truly was. When she finally put the pen down, Sarah felt lighter, as if the act of putting her dreams into words had given them a little more weight, a little more possibility. The next morning, as she walked Ethan to school, Sarah glanced at the horizon. The early light painted the city in soft hues of pink and gold, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The subway car rattled as Sarah gripped the metal pole, trying to steady herself against the jostling crowd. Ethan clung tightly to her hand, his small face tilted upward, his wide eyes darting around the chaos of the bustling train. It was their first trip to Manhattan in years, and the sheer energy of the city had left him both awed and overwhelmed. "Mommy, are we there yet?" Ethan's voice rose above the screech of the brakes as the train slowed for the next stop. "Almost, sweetheart. Just one more stop," Sarah replied, squeezing his hand reassuringly. She checked the time on her phone. The program interview was scheduled for 10:30 a.m., and it was already 10:15. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of anxiety and frustration. A delay at the station earlier had thrown off their timing, and now they were rushing to make it. The subway screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. Sarah tugged Ethan forward, weaving through the crowd as they stepped onto the platform. The noise of the station enveloped them. Announcements crackling over the speakers, the hum of distant trains, and the murmur of hurried commuters. "Stay close to me, Ethan," Sarah said, her voice firm but kind. They ascended the stairs, sunlight streaming through the grates above as they emerged onto the street. The towering buildings of Manhattan loomed around them, their glass facades reflecting the morning light. Ethan gasped, his head swiveling to take it all in. "It's so big here," he exclaimed, his voice filled with wonder. Sarah managed a smile, but her focus remained on finding their destination. She glanced at the map on her phone, her finger tracing the route to the office building. They were only a few blocks away, but time was running out. As they hurried down the sidewalk, Ethan stumbled over a crack in the pavement. Sarah caught him before he fell, but the sudden stop sent her papers flying from the folder she had been clutching. "Oh no," she muttered, kneeling to gather them. "Let me help," Ethan said, crouching beside her. The wind caught one of the pages, sending it fluttering down the sidewalk. Sarah groaned, scrambling to retrieve it when a polished leather shoe stepped on the paper, pinning it in place. "Here," a deep voice said. Sarah looked up and froze. The man towering above her was impeccably dressed, his dark tailored suit fitting him perfectly. His blue eyes were sharp, his jawline strong, and his dark hair was neatly styled. He held out the paper, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "Thank you," Sarah managed to say, her voice wavering slightly as she took the page from his hand. "No problem," the man replied, his tone polite but distant. His gaze flicked briefly to Ethan, who was staring up at him with wide, curious eyes, and then back to Sarah. For a moment, their eyes met. Sarah felt a strange pull, as if the world around them had momentarily gone quiet. There was something about his presence, commanding yet subtle, that made it impossible to look away. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come. The man gave a small nod and continued on his way, his stride confident and purposeful. "Mommy, who was that?" Ethan asked, watching the man disappear into the crowd. "I have no idea," Sarah said, shaking her head as she gathered the rest of her papers. "Come on, we need to hurry." They reached the office building with only minutes to spare. Sarah's cheeks were flushed, her breath coming in short gasps as they stepped into the sleek, modern lobby. She checked in at the front desk, then hurried to the elevators with Ethan at her side. The interview itself was a blur. Sarah did her best to answer the panel's questions, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. Ethan sat quietly in the corner, coloring in a book Sarah had brought to keep him occupied. By the time they left the building, Sarah felt both exhausted and relieved. The weight of the morning seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a cautious optimism. "Did you do good, Mommy?" Ethan asked as they walked down the street. "I think so," Sarah said, smiling down at him. "We'll just have to wait and see." As they made their way back to the subway station, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the man who had helped her. There had been something striking about him, something she couldn't quite put into words. But she pushed the thought aside. People like him didn't linger in her world. What Sarah didn't know was that Alexander Carter, the man she had encountered, was equally unsettled. As Alexander entered his high-rise office overlooking Central Park, his assistant, Claire, greeted him with a stack of documents that required his attention. But his mind wasn't on work. The woman from the sidewalk had stayed with him, her wide, startled eyes flashing through his memory. She hadn't looked like the people he normally encountered, polished, calculated, always trying to impress him. There had been a rawness to her, a sense of urgency that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with her own struggles. "Mr. Carter? Is everything all right?" Claire asked, noticing his distraction. "Fine," Alexander said curtly, shaking off the thought. But as he sat at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him, he couldn't help wondering about the woman and her little boy. Who is she? And why couldn't he stop thinking about her? Sarah's encounter with the sharply dressed man lingered in her mind for days, though she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the intensity of his gaze, or the fleeting sense that he had truly seen her in a way that most people didn't. Regardless, her life continued its relentless march forward, leaving little time for daydreams or what-ifs. The program's decision loomed over her like a storm cloud, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. Every time the phone rang, her heart jumped, only to sink when it wasn't the call she was waiting for. At work, the customers' voices blended into a monotonous hum, and even Ethan's cheerful chatter couldn't quite pull her out of the fog. On a particularly slow afternoon at the diner, Sarah found herself absent-mindedly wiping down the counter. Jill slid onto one of the stools, her energy cutting through the gloom like sunlight through a break in the clouds. "You look like you've been hit by a truck," Jill said, taking a sip of the coffee Sarah automatically poured for her. "Thanks for the boost of confidence," Sarah replied dryly, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "Seriously, what's going on? Is it the program? Are you still waiting to hear back?" Sarah nodded, leaning against the counter. "I can't stop thinking about it. Every time the phone rings, I feel like I'm going to have a heart attack." "You'll get it," Jill said confidently. "They'd be crazy not to choose you. You're smart, you're determined and broke," Sarah interrupted, her tone tinged with bitterness. "Hey, cut that out," Jill said firmly. "You've got what it takes, Sarah. You just need someone to see it." Sarah let out a small laugh. "You're starting to sound like one of those motivational posters." Jill smirked. "Well, somebody's got to keep you from spiraling into despair. Speaking of which, how's my godson?" "Ethan's fine," Sarah said, her smile softening. "He's been asking about the program, though. I think he's more excited about it than I am." "That's because he believes in you, just like I do," Jill said, her voice warm. "And speaking of things to believe in, tell me about this guy you bumped into in Manhattan. You mentioned him the other day, but you didn't give me any details." Sarah rolled her eyes. "There's nothing to tell. He helped me pick up my papers and that was it. He was probably just a businessman on his way to an important meeting." Jill raised an eyebrow. "Was he hot?" "Jill? What? I'm just asking. You deserve a little excitement in your life." Sarah shook her head, but the memory of the man's striking blue eyes flickered in her mind. "He was intimidating," she admitted. "The kind of guy who probably eats at restaurants where the menus don't even have prices." Jill grinned. "So, rich and hot. Got it?" "Stop," Sarah said, though her cheeks flushed despite herself. "It doesn't matter. I'll never see him again." But Sarah was wrong. Across town, Alexander Carter sat in his corner office, the city skyline stretching out behind him like a postcard. Despite the luxurious surroundings, his focus was elsewhere. The image of the woman and her son from the sidewalk continued to intrude on his thoughts, distracting him in ways he couldn't understand. He leaned back in his chair, his mind replaying the brief encounter. There had been something striking about her, not just her appearance, though she was undeniably attractive, but the way she had looked at him. Her gaze had been unguarded, filled with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. It was a stark contrast to the polished facades he encountered daily in his world of high-powered meetings and socialite events. "Mr. Carter?" Claire's voice interrupted his reverie, and he turned to see his assistant standing in the doorway. "Yes? You asked me to gather information about the charity event next week. It's all here," she said, placing a folder on his desk. "Also, the board meeting has been rescheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. "Thank you, Claire," Alexander said, though his tone lacked its usual crispness. As she left, he picked up the folder but didn't open it. Instead, he found himself staring out the window, his mind drifting back to the woman and the boy. It wasn't like him to fixate on a stranger, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. With a decisive breath, Alexander turned to his computer and opened a search engine. He hesitated for a moment before typing, "Manhattan career programs, family-friendly." It was a long shot, but something told him she had been in the area for a purpose. Scrolling through the results, one name caught his attention. a program offering business administration training for underprivileged individuals. The application deadline had just passed, and it was based near the area where they had collided. Alexander's curiosity deepened. He picked up his phone and dialed a number, speaking briefly with someone in charge of the program. After a few minutes, he hung up, leaning back in his chair with a small smile. He had the name, Sarah Matthews. That evening, Sarah and Ethan sat together on the couch, a bowl of popcorn between them as they watched a cartoon. It was one of their rare quiet moments, and Sarah savored it, her arm wrapped around her son's shoulders. "Mommy, do you think we'll live in a big house someday?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. Sarah looked down at him, her heart aching at the question. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly. "But I'm working hard so we can have a better life." Ethan nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "I think you're the best mommy ever." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them away, kissing the top of his head. "And you're the best son ever." As they sat there, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her life was on the brink of something unexpected. Whether it was the program, the mysterious man from Manhattan, or something else entirely, she didn't know. But for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. Little did she know, Alexander Carter was already planning his next move. The air in Manhattan that evening carried a crispness that hinted at the approaching winter, the city alive with the energy of people hurrying to dinners, parties, and meetings. Alexander Carter stood near the large window of his penthouse apartment, looking out at the glittering skyline. From this height, the city seemed almost serene, the chaos below muted by distance. But his thoughts were far from serene. The name, Sarah Matthews, lingered in his mind, as did the brief research he had done earlier that day. She lived in a suburb on the outskirts of New York City, worked as a waitress, and had a son named Ethan. It wasn't much, but it was enough to paint a picture of a life far removed from his own. Alexander didn't fully understand why he was so drawn to her. Maybe it was the determination he had seen in her eyes, or the way she had fiercely protected her son even in the smallest moments. Whatever the reason, he felt an inexplicable need to know more. The sound of his phone buzzing pulled him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, his assistant Claire's name flashing on the screen. "Go ahead," he said, his tone clipped but polite. "Mr. Carter, I've finalized the guest list for the Foundation's networking gala tomorrow night," Claire said. "I thought you might want to review it before I send it out." "Just email it to me," Alexander replied. "Anything else?" "Yes, actually. The director of the career advancement program you inquired about reached out to say they're still reviewing applications. They'll be making final decisions by next week." Alexander nodded, though Claire couldn't see him. "Could keep me updated." After ending the call, Alexander stared at his phone for a moment. The gala tomorrow night would be another gathering of Manhattan's elite, investors, philanthropists, and CEOs, all dressed in their finest and exchanging thinly veiled power plays disguised as polite conversation. Normally, he viewed these events as obligatory, a necessary part of maintaining his influence in the city. But this time, he felt a twinge of something else. Anticipation. Sarah, meanwhile, stood in front of her small closet, biting her lip as she tried to decide what to wear. The invitation to the gala had been completely unexpected. Earlier that day, the program director had called to inform her that she had been shortlisted for the final round of interviews. As part of the process, she was invited to attend a networking event hosted by one of the program's largest donors, a real estate magnate with a reputation for supporting philanthropic causes. She had nearly declined the invitation on the spot. Between finding a babysitter for Ethan and the sheer terror of attending an event so far outside her comfort zone, the idea felt impossible. But Jill had intervened, as always. "You're going," Jill had declared firmly. "I'll watch Ethan, and we'll find you something to wear." "You deserve to be there, Sarah." Now, hours later, Sarah was still second-guessing her decision. She pulled a simple navy blue dress from the hanger, holding it up to the mirror. It wasn't designer, but it was elegant enough to pass. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, though the words didn't entirely sink in. The grand ballroom at the Metropolitan Club was a vision of opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, their light reflecting off the polished marble floors and the rows of glittering glasses filled with champagne. Sarah stepped into the space, her heart pounding. She felt out of place, like a child playing dress-up among adults. Everywhere she looked, people were dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits, their conversations filled with names and jargon she didn't recognize. But she reminded herself why she was here. This wasn't just a party, it was an opportunity. The program director had encouraged her to mingle, to meet potential mentors or even future employers. She took a deep breath and stepped further into the room. Alexander spotted her almost immediately. He hadn't expected her to attend, at least not tonight. But there she was, looking both nervous and determined as she surveyed the room. She wore a simple dress that set her apart from the sea of extravagance, but somehow, it only made her more striking. Without overthinking it, Alexander made his way toward her. Sarah was studying a piece of art on the wall when a deep, familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "I wasn't expecting to see you here," the man said. She turned, her breath catching when she saw him. It was him, the man from the sidewalk. Up close, he was even more imposing, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his sharp blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You," she said, unable to mask her surprise. "Alexander Carter," he said, offering his hand. "And you are?" "Sarah Matthews," she replied, shaking his hand. Their hands lingered for a moment longer than necessary before she pulled away, suddenly self-conscious. "What brings you here, Ms. Matthews?" Alexander asked, his tone polite but curious. "I'm here for the career advancement program," Sarah explained, her cheeks flushing slightly. "They invited me to this event as part of the interview process." "I see," Alexander said, his interest piqued. "And how are you finding it so far?" "A little overwhelming," Sarah admitted, glancing around the room. "This isn't exactly my usual scene." Alexander smiled, a genuine expression that softened his otherwise serious features. "It can be intimidating. But you belong here as much as anyone else." Sarah looked at him, startled by the sincerity in his voice. She wasn't sure what she had expected from him, arrogance, maybe, or indifference, but not this. Before she could respond, a waiter approached with a tray of champagne. Alexander took 2 glasses, offering one to Sarah. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. Sarah hesitated for a moment before clinking her glass against his. "To new beginnings." As the evening unfolded, Alexander stayed by her side, guiding her through the maze of introductions and conversations. He introduced her to people she never would have dared approach on her own, his presence lending her a confidence she hadn't known she possessed. By the end of the night, Sarah felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. As she stood on the steps of the Metropolitan Club, waiting for her cab, Alexander appeared beside her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything tonight." "It was my pleasure," he replied. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the noise of the city seemed to fade away. "Good night, Ms. Matthews," Alexander said, his voice low. "Good night," she replied, stepping into the cab. As the car pulled away, Sarah glanced back to see Alexander still standing there, watching her leave. She had no idea that her life had just taken a turn she never could have imagined. And neither did Alexander. The days following the gala were a blur for Sarah. Between her shifts at the diner, looking after Ethan, and replaying her evening with Alexander Carter, she found herself unable to focus on much else. Their conversations, the way he had treated her as if she belonged in a room full of Manhattan's elite, it all felt surreal, like a scene from a movie she didn't quite believe she was in. Jill, of course, was eager for every detail. "And then what?" Jill asked, leaning forward on Sarah's couch, her eyes wide with excitement. "That's it," Sarah said, folding laundry as Ethan played with his toy cars on the carpet. "That's it? Are you kidding me? The Alexander Carter stayed by your side the whole night, introduced you to everyone important, and that's where the story ends?" "Yes, that's where it ends," Sarah replied, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "He was just being polite. It's not like I'm ever going to see him again." Jill scoffed. "Polite? Sarah, men like Alexander Carter don't just play nice for no reason. He's interested in you." "Interested in what?" A broke, overworked waitress with a 6-year-old kid? Be serious, Jill. I'm being serious. You don't see it, but you're incredible. If he doesn't call you, he's the one missing out. Sarah laughed, but her friend's words planted a seed of hope she didn't dare nurture. Meanwhile, Alexander couldn't shake Sarah from his thoughts. He told himself it was curiosity. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, her honesty and determination a refreshing contrast to the polished facades he encountered daily. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He spent hours in his office staring at contracts he couldn't focus on, the memory of her smile tugging at the edges of his concentration. He had wealth, power, and influence, yet none of it had ever left him feeling as grounded as a single conversation with Sarah Matthews. One afternoon, Alexander found himself calling Claire. "Mr. Carter," she said as she picked up. "What can I do for you?" "Look into Sarah Matthews for me." Discreetly. "I want to know more about her background." There was a pause on the other end before Claire responded carefully. "Understood. Anything in particular you're looking for?" "Just everything," Alexander said, his voice clipped, betraying his discomfort with the request. "And keep it quiet?" "Yes, sir." Sarah's reprieve from her financial struggles didn't last long. A few days later, she received an envelope from her landlord. She opened it with trembling hands, her heart sinking as she read the notice. Her rent was being raised by $300 starting next month. "That's impossible," she whispered to herself, sitting down at the kitchen table. The math didn't add up. Even with her tips from the diner, she barely made enough to cover her current expenses. Adding more to her monthly rent was out of the question. Ethan appeared in the doorway, holding his favorite stuffed dinosaur. "Mommy? Are you okay?" Sarah forced a smile, hiding the letter under a stack of mail. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Why don't you go get ready for bed?" Once Ethan was asleep, Sarah sat at the table, her head in her hands. The stress felt unbearable, the weight of her responsibilities pressing down like an anchor. As if sensing her despair, her phone buzzed. She picked it up and saw an unfamiliar number. "Hello," she answered hesitantly. "Ms. Matthews?" "It's Alexander Carter." Her breath caught. "Mr. Carter? How did you get my number?" "I have my ways," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, not at all," Sarah said, though her heart raced at the sound of his voice. "I wanted to let you know that the program's board approved your application," Alexander said. "You'll be receiving an official notification soon." Sarah's jaw dropped. "What? Are you serious?" "Completely. Congratulations." Tears sprang to her eyes. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." "You've earned it, Sarah," Alexander said warmly. "And I was hoping we could celebrate. Dinner tomorrow night?" Sarah froze, her mind racing. Was he serious? Could she even consider saying yes? "I'm not sure," she stammered. "I understand," Alexander said. "But the invitation stands. Think about it." After the call ended, Sarah sat in stunned silence. Why would a man like Alexander Carter want to take her to dinner? The next evening, Sarah found herself outside a restaurant she never dreamed of entering. Jill had insisted she go, practically shoving her out the door with a borrowed pair of heels and a pep talk. "Whatever happens, just enjoy it," Jill had said. "You deserve this." Inside, Alexander was waiting. When she entered, his face lit up, his sharp blue eyes softening as he stood to greet her. "Sarah," he said, his voice warm. "I'm glad you came." The evening unfolded like a dream. The restaurant was elegant but intimate, the food delicious, though Sarah barely tasted it. They talked for hours, and she found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She told him about Ethan, about her struggles, and even about the rent increase that threatened to derail everything. Alexander listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "You've been through so much," he said, "but you're still standing. That says a lot about you." Sarah blushed, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to anyone seeing her as strong. As they left the restaurant, Alexander walked her to her car. The crisp night air surrounded them, the city's lights twinkling like stars. "Thank you for tonight," Sarah said, her voice soft. "It's only the beginning," Alexander replied, his gaze steady. For a moment, She wondered what he meant, but the intensity of his look left her breathless. "Good night, Sarah," he said, stepping back. "Good night," she whispered, climbing into her car. As she drove away, her heart raced, a mixture of hope and fear swirling inside her. Alexander Carter was a man who could change her life, but at what cost? She wasn't sure if she was ready to find out. Unbeknownst to her, Alexander was grappling with his own questions. The secrets of his family and business were closing in on him, threatening to drag him into a storm that could shatter everything. And Sarah Matthews was now a part of his world, whether she realized it or not. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Sarah. The program had officially accepted her, and she was attending classes twice a week in Manhattan while juggling her shifts at the diner and caring for Ethan. It was exhausting, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was moving forward instead of simply treading water. What unsettled her most, however, was Alexander. Since their dinner, he had been reaching out regularly, not in an overbearing way, but enough to keep her off balance. Texts asking how she was doing, offers to help when she needed it, and even small gestures like having coffee delivered to her during late-night study sessions. Sarah had never met anyone like him. He seemed genuinely interested in her life, but his world felt impossibly far from her own. She couldn't shake the feeling that letting him in was risky, like standing too close to the edge of a cliff. Her fears weren't unfounded. Alexander sat in the boardroom of his company's Manhattan headquarters, the atmosphere tense as his board of directors discussed the fallout from a recent scandal. A competitor had leaked documents suggesting that Carter Enterprises had cut corners on several major projects, and while the claims were unfounded, the accusations had shaken investor confidence. "We need to control the narrative," one board member said. "The media is already running with this, and our stock has dropped by 5% in 2 days." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'll handle the media," he said calmly, "and I want a full audit of the projects in question. If there's even a hint of truth to these accusations, I want to know." The room fell silent. Alexander's authority was absolute, but the tension was palpable. His reputation as a relentless businessman had made him powerful enemies, and it was clear someone was trying to exploit the smallest vulnerability. As the meeting adjourned, Claire approached him. "There's another issue," she said quietly, handing him a folder. Alexander opened it, his jaw tightening as he scanned the contents. The document was a private report on Sarah Matthews. It detailed her financial struggles, her past relationships, and her current acceptance into the career advancement program. "Why am I looking at this?" he asked sharply. "The board is concerned," Claire said, her voice measured. "They think your involvement with Ms. Matthews could be seen as a distraction, or worse, a liability." Alexander closed the folder with a snap, his blue eyes cold. "My personal life is none of the board's business." Claire hesitated. "With all due respect, Alexander, this isn't just personal. The media loves a good story, and if they catch wind of this, I'll deal with it," he said firmly. But even as he dismissed Claire, a knot of unease settled in his chest. The life he had built was precarious, and bringing Sarah into it was already causing ripples he couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Sarah's life was unraveling in its own way. The rent increase loomed large, and no matter how she adjusted her budget, she couldn't make the numbers work. She had thought about telling Alexander, but the idea of relying on him for something so personal felt wrong. It all came to a head one evening when Ethan came down with a fever. "Mommy, my head hurts," he murmured, his face flushed as he curled up on the couch. Sarah pressed her hand to his forehead, worry tightening her chest. He was burning up, and her thermometer confirmed a high fever. "Okay, sweetheart," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "We're going to the doctor." The emergency room was crowded, the hours dragging as Sarah sat with Ethan in her lap, her nerves fraying with every passing minute. When they were finally seen, the doctor assured her it was a viral infection that would pass with rest and fluids. Relieved but exhausted, Sarah paid the copay with the last of her emergency funds and took Ethan home. By the time she got him settled into bed, her own emotions boiled over. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills and the rent notice, tears streaming down her face. She was doing everything she could, but it wasn't enough. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it to see a message from Alexander. "How are you holding up?" She stared at the screen, the temptation to pour everything out to him almost unbearable. But instead, she typed a simple response. "I'm fine. Just tired." A moment later, her phone rang. "Sarah," Alexander said when she answered, his voice warm and steady. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed her. "Sarah," he repeated, softer this time. "Talk to me." For a moment, she considered brushing him off, but the dam broke. She told him everything about the rent, the bills, and Ethan's fever. She hadn't meant to, but once she started, it all came tumbling out. Alexander listened without interrupting, his silence encouraging her to keep going. When she finished, he said simply, "Let me help?" "No," Sarah said quickly. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Alexander interrupted, his tone firm but gentle. "You're working yourself to exhaustion, Sarah. You don't have to do this alone." "It's not that simple," she said, her voice breaking. "It is," Alexander replied. "Let me take care of the rent. Just this once. Focus on Ethan and your program. The rest can wait." Sarah hesitated, the weight of her pride warring with her desperation. Finally, she whispered. The next morning, Sarah woke to find an email from her landlord confirming that her rent had been paid in full for the next 3 months. She stared at the screen, equal parts relieved and overwhelmed. Jill, of course, had opinions. "Why are you second-guessing this?" Jill asked as they folded laundry later that day. "The man has more money than God, and he wants to help you. Let him." "It's not just about the money," Sarah said. "It's about what it means. What if he expects something in return? Do you think Alexander is that kind of guy?" Jill asked. "No," Sarah admitted. "But I barely know him. And his world, it's so different from mine. I don't know if I can trust it." Jill gave her a knowing look. Maybe the problem isn't trusting him. Maybe it's trusting yourself to be happy. Sarah didn't answer. But as she sat on her couch that night, staring at her son sleeping peacefully, she realized Jill might be right. Alexander Carter was offering her a lifeline. The question was whether she was brave enough to take it, and what that choice might cost them both. The sun hung low over Manhattan, painting the city in shades of gold and rose as Sarah walked into the cafe where Alexander had asked to meet her. Her heart raced as she spotted him at a corner table, looking effortlessly elegant in a charcoal gray suit, his gaze already fixed on her as if sensing her presence before she even arrived. "Sarah," he said, standing to greet her. "Hi," she replied softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear as he pulled out her chair. It had been weeks since he had paid her rent, weeks where she had wrestled with the enormity of what that gesture meant. But she hadn't been idle. She had thrown herself into the program, impressed her instructors, and even earned her first freelance project assisting a small business with its marketing strategy. She wasn't the same woman she had been a few months ago. And yet, when she looked at Alexander, she felt that same spark of uncertainty and undeniable attraction that had unsettled her from the moment they met. "How's Ethan?" he asked as they sat down, his voice warm with genuine interest. "He's doing great," Sarah said with a smile. "He keeps asking when he'll get to see you again." Alexander chuckled. "I'd like that. He's a great kid. You've done an amazing job raising him." The compliment hit her harder than she expected, her throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander leaned forward, his blue eyes searching hers. "I've been thinking about us, Sarah. About how much my life has changed since I met you." She stiffened slightly, her instincts telling her to brace for the inevitable rejection, the part where he admitted this was all too complicated for someone like him. "But instead of complicating things, you've brought clarity," he continued. "You've reminded me of what's real, what matters. You and Ethan, you're exactly what I've been missing." Sarah's breath caught. "Alexander, I don't." "Let me finish," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I know this hasn't been easy for you. I know my world can be overwhelming. But I don't want you to think for 1 second that you're not enough. You're more than enough, Sarah. And I want to build something real with you. With both of you." Her walls began to crumble, the weight of his words cutting through her doubts. "You don't know what you're signing up for," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, I do," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I'm signing up for you. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." Tears blurred her vision, but a smile broke through her disbelief. "You're not making this easy to say no to?" "Good," he said with a soft smile. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the bustling cafe fading into the background. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that she could have this, that she could have him, and still be true to herself. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's try." Alexander's face lit up, and for the first time, Sarah saw a glimpse of vulnerability in him, a man who had just gotten exactly what he wanted. Months later, Sarah stood with Ethan and Alexander in Central Park, the spring blossoms in full bloom around them. Ethan laughed as Alexander lifted him onto his shoulders, the two of them playing a game that Sarah couldn't quite follow but loved watching nonetheless. "You're spoiling him, you know," Sarah teased, her smile widening as Alexander turned to look at her. "Get used to it," he said, his tone playful but serious. As Ethan shouted for Alexander to spin him again, Sarah felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had taken a chance, not just on Alexander, but on herself, and it had led her here, to a life she never thought she could have. When Alexander pulled her into his arms later that evening, whispering about plans for their future, Sarah knew she had made the right choice. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through Sarah and Alexander's love story. We hope you felt every twist, turn, and heartfelt moment just as much as we did while creating it for you. If you love this story and want more captivating tales like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll never miss an update, and you'll always have a front row seat to the most unforgettable stories we bring to life. We're just getting started, and with your support, we can keep creating more content that inspires, excites, and tugs at your heartstrings. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when we post something new. Thank you again for being part of this amazing community. We'll see you in the next video.